Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the T-Systems Security webinar, 3 Steps to Secure Your OT Network. We're going to discuss the challenges of securing vulnerabilities in operational technology networks and how to take steps to mitigate these risks. Now, the webinar is being recorded and it will take about 20 minutes. Your lines are currently muted. Following the webinar, we will be having an opportunity for you to ask questions. And if you just have a quick look now, there's a short guide as to how to do that. So to ask your questions, you can either use the hand icon, raise your hand, and the host, that's Connie, will unmute you so that you can ask your question directly. Or alternatively, there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen, which you can use. Just remember to select to ask all panelists and type in your question there. So we do encourage you to ask questions, so get thinking. So I think we're ready to start. So I'm delighted to hand over to Scott Cairns, who is the Chief Technology Officer and Head of Security for T-Systems Northern European region, and he's going to be leading the webinar. Scott, can I pass over to you, please?
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's all good.
Good. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This webinar was something we thought about some time ago, but I think it's probably even more relevant today, as hopefully we'll see as we go through it. So thanks for joining us. I know it's tricky times. So as I said, we're living in a bit of a strange time with everything that's going on right now. And when we originally planned this, we had no idea we were speaking to you today in the situation we're in. But the fact of the matter is, despite current activities and how we're currently living our lives in recent months, security is one area we can't afford to relax. When we look at ICS security, perhaps now more than ever, it's critical that we ensure stability and security of these systems that we used to class as ICS systems. We now find ourselves in a really weird environment where rational approaches to what constitutes CNI or critical national infrastructure could perhaps be widened to include production lines or manufacturing of things that we're going to need over the coming months to outlast this pandemic. So I don't want to bombard you with metrics today, but one thing I wanted to highlight was one of our partners, CyberX, did a really good study a few months back around ICS security and the sort of impact it has on our daily lives. And one of the figures that just stuck out in my head was this one around the number of sites out there currently today that still operate equipment that can be accessed using standard protocols remotely. If you think about the value of 54%, half of our sites have some sort of equipment that can be accessed remotely using standard protocols. It's quite a scary number, but that's the only metric I'm going to throw at you today. I just wanted to sort of get you thinking about the level of risk we are talking about when we talk about ICS security. So without further ado, we'll get into what we're going to discuss today. So in this brief session, I wanted to not dwell too much on the metrics or make this a big scary story, but to give a balanced briefing. So what I want to do is cover off a brief history of how we got to where we are, and then I want to move swiftly on to how we can start to make serious inroads into tackling the problem. So we'll start with a brief history of the adversaries, how we can understand the risks we're facing and what scale these risks are. We can then look at what simple steps can be taken to try and handle on the size and scale of the problem, making changes that work toward mitigating or removing the risks. This is pretty critical, to be honest, because then we can finish with looking at more strategic measures or things we want to do in the long term, and then we'll open up for questions after that. I mean, ICS security is a vast topic, so we can't cover off every particular element in this session in this sort of 30-40 minutes of time. But we hope to give you an introduction about how you can get a handle on practical steps to take in order to start moving forwards with your battle against securing the ICS environment. So when we talk about the attackers, it's key to know what we really mean by this. So things have changed over the past few decades. So back in the late 90s, I was responsible for security for a major utility company. And most of our time was focused on firewalls and securing firewalls and rolling out antivirus patches. Things have definitely moved on since then. You know, back then we were dealing with things like the viruses and other sort of threats that we saw on a weekly basis. But these things could be identified and removed. You know, attackers liked their exploits to be known for. They wanted them attributed to them. They wanted to take credit for the attacks. Things have definitely moved on over the recent years, not just in the methods of defense, but also in the motivation behind the attacks. The sort of attacks we're now facing. So back when I was looking after security for the utility company, all the attacks were targeted information technology or IT systems, servers, desktops, laptops, At the time, this was seen as the biggest attack landscape to go for. So the attackers loved actually attacking the operational technology, the IT technology, should we say, that was used day in, day out by a vast majority of people. The notion of actually doing this on operational technology was pretty remote. We hadn't really seen much of that time on the OT sector. It was a very uncommon attack vector. The attackers were looking for maximum disruption to business, and the way to achieve this was to take out as many nodes as possible. So what they tend to go for is go for the endpoints. If you manage to disable a company's desktop and laptop estate with a virus, you could cause massive disruption and a great loss of revenue. At the time, antivirus and security companies adapted their defenses. Over time, they became stronger and became a little bit harder for attackers to have the same impact on corporations as we've seen, although many still managed to do it. We started to see the emergence of a more targeted group of attackers, though. Often they were working together with different skill sets to combine their collaborative knowledge in order to attack in almost like a military level planning approach. Objectives changed, and while many aimed to cause disruption, the monetary gain became a real incentive for these groups where they had multi-talented individuals. And still one of the primary objectives was actually to disable the IT landscape and cause maximum damage. The problem is, once we've seen in recent years, and what started to develop was an influx of ransomware attacks we now face on a daily basis. The groups that actually do these attacks became known for this, and you see a lot of them actually putting their own propaganda or publicity out on the net now. But again, we were all talking about IT environments here. These attackers continue to target businesses, financial institutions, citizens, but then turn their approach towards organizations such as economies or to government operations. And these attacks became a bit more, should we say, darker in nature. If you think about the sort of exploits we've seen in recent years, funded organizations, the notion of nation-state attacks taking place, things are definitely taking a turn for the worse. Probably the most well-known example so far is the 2016 presidential election in America. Well, the fallout we've seen in recent years about who provided data to who was influencing the news, that was targeted at different demographics, skewing voting. There have been many reports and documentaries since 2016 on what actually happened here. And whilst I can't go into all of them today, I think if you're really interested in this topic, a good one to watch is a documentary on Netflix called The Great Hack, which tracks all the analysis around Cambridge Analytics and what actually happened during the election. The problem with this unchecked activity is if it's not tackled or mitigated by security teams, companies, vendors, and expert attackers backed by nations could start to look at economic collapse of the country as well. What we've seen so far, remember, is uncoordinated attacks on different elements of the economy, towards citizens, towards businesses, financial institutions, but we're starting to see political influence as well, and most recently medical attacks. Not just 2 years ago during WannaCry, but already during the pandemic we're now facing. We've seen the problem where attackers are actually going after hospitals, which is pretty low, but they are starting to do this. So we need to be very careful about how we secure our environments. But what we're really here to talk about today is operational technology security. So this is where we're focusing on now. All these attacks we described so far have predominantly been in the IT space. But what happens if an attacker starts going after operational technology? This is where things get a little bit scary. So historically, one of the primary methods we've employed in utility companies or critical national infrastructure or other OT industries is what's known as air gapping, which is really as simple as it sounds. It's all about saying you keep your information technology or your IT systems totally separated from or disconnected from your operation technology systems. No connection, no communication, no data is passed back and forth between the two landscapes. And for a long time this worked. Predominantly because, as we discussed earlier, the most significant impact was perceived to be taking out large-scale environments, so end-user populations. The problem with this is that people have moved on and attackers have moved on as well. They've switched their focus and realized that the most significant impact they can have is by moving upstream. So if they target utility companies or critical suppliers, they can have a much far-reaching and greater attack and result on the population of a country or economy. The reason it's attractive to attackers is that most operational technology still runs out of date or unpatched systems. So when it comes to operational technology, we are risk adverse, and we always have been. If our production lines and our critical machinery is functioning optimally, we want to leave it alone. We steer clear of potentially injecting any risk into the situation. While this seems a good approach, the detrimental impact on the security of those systems could be catastrophic. Systems that are running outdated and unpatched code introduce vulnerabilities through unmitigated exploits, and we do know this from our experience on the IT landscapes. The thing is, as you might remember, I mentioned air gaps earlier on. We talked about a way to keep attackers away from critical systems, by air-gapping these ideas. The problem is we've seen how these methods can fail. An attacker who is intent on penetrating your operational technology landscape will succeed if your only defense is an air-gap method. In 2010, information surfaced in the security community about the attacks that are soon to become known as Stuxnet. I think probably most of you are probably aware of this. Stuxnet was a good example of an attack on an OT landscape that was air-gapped from the IT landscape. And in this instance, the attackers worked backwards through the supply chain. What they actually did was they worked on the maintenance teams who provided servicing to the critical OT systems on the network. So in this case, it was the supplier who serviced the centrifuge equipment for the uranium enrichment plant, power plant. What they did was they dropped code onto the IT network of the maintenance company. So not the actual company they were targeting themselves, but the maintenance company within the supply chain. This code specifically looked for USB drives. And what it did is anytime an IT individual stuck the USB drive in their machine, it dropped the code onto that USB stick. The theory was the attackers wanted these maintenance engineers to go to the enrichment plant and plug the USB drive into one of the OT systems, thus jumping over the air gap and allowing direct access into the OT network. And for those who saw the story at the time and then the reports in the years to come after that, it worked. And the attackers were able to blow several centrifuges on that network. So another problem we're facing at the minute is the advent of the Internet of Things. These IoT devices and IIoT devices are popping up everywhere, and they further complicate the environments that security teams now have to manage. Companies are looking to invest in the latest technology, obviously, to enhance their capabilities. And up until recently, regulations and controls around IoT development weren't really fit for purpose. They tended to lean on the regulations developed for the telecommunication industry that were developed for mobile devices. The problem is IoT devices connect to corporate infrastructure in a very different way to mobile devices, and they require different regulations and controls. Another problem in this is that the cost of production of these IoT devices is relatively cheap. It's a very low barrier to entry into the market. And because this low barrier to entry exists, omissions are made in the security protocols that should be put in place to protect against vulnerabilities, and more problems are introduced. Now, there's been a lot of stories in the media about weak or no security on IoT devices, and devices that don't consider encryption or data at rest to be a critical importance. So what we have here is an escalating risk level around our operational technology environments. We've got systems or unpatched or ill-equipped systems to resist attack, and this new wave of IoT and IoT devices coming into the market, which are opening up more opportunities for attackers to take hold of. So it's pretty obvious things need to change. The attackers have evolved, and we really need to look at how we evolve too. So the key thing is to understanding and assessing the risk of the attack. We know we've got a problem. We know our operational technology landscape is not really up to par, and we know we're facing increased threats from a really determined adversary who's only got their own interests at heart. So if this were an IT network, we would know exactly what to do. We'd know how to do the patching. We'd know how to apply security measures, mitigate risks. The problem is that an IT network is not an OT network, and it comes with some real inherent obstacles if you want to move forwards and secure your environment. OT environments are complex, incredibly complex, with a large number of devices and systems entirely alien for most of us operating within the IT space. Systems from companies like Siemens are prevalent, which are hardly ever seen inside a common office environment. How do you deal with this? Would IT security experts understand the nuances of an OT landscape? It's questionable. The criticality of some of these systems or methods of operating in this space are a bit different to what we normally used to in our IT space. Historically, probably most of the IT security teams wouldn't really know how to operate in this space because they're being kept at arm's length. But the scary thing is the more CISOs I speak to these days, they're all talking about having to get involved in the OT space. They're being told it's not just the purview to look after the IT systems now. They need to focus on looking after the operational technology space as well. This is precisely what they're being asked to do. Corporations are becoming more aware of the threat to the industrial systems, and they're often saying to the CISOs, this is now your remit as well. The problem is, once the panic subsides in having to tackle this problem, you need to create a long list of activities that must be undertaken in order to reach a stable state. This isn't as easy as it sounds. These systems are the lifeblood of the corporation. They operate 24/7 with minimal downtime. They're distributed. They're often away from the office environments in a siloed area. And if these systems go offline for even a few minutes, the repercussions on production quotas or sales or resultant revenue can be incredibly impactful on the company. The The managers of these systems are normally very skeptical of IT teams as well. They don't like the IT teams touching their OT environments. They don't like the introduction of change, and they don't like doing this because it introduces risk. The problem is they do acknowledge that they're increasingly a target and they are at risk. This again was highlighted in the metric I put up at the start about the CyberX report around the 54%. And just to give you one other metric, the one thing I do think is quite scary, that there was 1,800 firms interviewed or 1,800 sites assessed during that CyberX report. And 62% of those sites were still operating Windows XP and Windows 2000 Server, which is a pretty scary situation to be in. I guess this is also, remember how many people admitted to running these systems. I'm sure the number is actually a great deal higher than this. So we know these systems are being targeted, and we know there's a genuine threat that air gapping doesn't work in a way of controlling these exploits. Older systems continue to be a problem. So last summer we saw an interesting phenomenon where we saw a wormable flaw in the RDP protocol Microsoft reported to the globe, and they released patches on all the platforms. The interesting thing to note was at the time they also released patches for Windows XP and Windows 2000 Server and Windows 2003 Server. I mean, this is unheard of. This was such a real threat they felt to the environment, and they were very aware of the threat this placed on OT technology that they released patches for really outdated, unsupported systems. But it was definitely a kick that got a lot of people thinking about what we need to do in the OT space, how we need to move forward with security in that space just as strongly as we do in the IT space. So the stakes are far higher if things go wrong, but the stakes are also high if we make a mistake. So key thing is what can be done in this space? How do we actually do something to go about securing our OT environments? Initially, I suppose, what are the critical first steps towards securing these environments? First, developing a strategy to tackle what appears to be this insurmountable challenge may feel really daunting. If you break it down into pragmatic steps, though, there are immediate actions that can be taken to minimize the risk while you work on long-term strategy. So it doesn't become as daunting as it first seems. I'm going to run through a few of these now. One thing I just do want to put forward straight away, and I do have this conversation a lot with CISOs when we talk about the OT space. The important thing to remember is you're not alone in this. It's amazing that our security community does come together when we're all under threat or organizations are under threat. Everyone faces the same common adversary. We're all here to try and defend our organizations, and we're all defending against the same sort of attackers. What this means is, realistically, you've got an incredible army of vendors, white hats, systems integrators such as ourselves, consultants, who are all pulling together to try and defeat the same adversaries trying to attack our environments. And usually it doesn't take long just to look around and pick up the phone and ring a fellow security expert to get some help or advice on how they tackle the problem. It's not about getting a market advantage over your colleagues, it's about helping each other to defeat the same objective. So it's always worth just dropping into security communities to see if anyone's got any ideas about how to help. So back to how we actually implement change here, or implement some sort of mechanism or steps. One of the key things we normally talk to customers around is vulnerability scanning. Now, this is really common in our IT space. We do this a lot. We do it all the time. We use tools such as Qualys to scan all our IT systems and understand where the threats lie. But for IT environments, vulnerability scans are a good, solid first step to take in the OT environment. Performing vulnerability scans on the environment help to understand the extent of the challenge. They'll highlight areas that you are unaware of and systems that maybe have dropped off the radar but are still functional within the environment, thereby being a risk. Most importantly, though, they show you the risks that need addressing first. The scans provide a great deal of visibility of all the assets across the environment, often exposing assets that are untracked or have lost track over time. This helps build up a really rich picture of the OT landscape. And these steps can actually help you get a really good handle and a clearer picture on the OT estate as a whole, and where you must concentrate initial efforts. I mean, any newly added assets that have been lost can be integrated into your asset management database, which is a great side plan actually of running a vulnerability assessment. It helps enrich your content stored on your whole environment and your asset management database, and probably helps your asset team to get a more comprehensive view of what's going on OT environment. But whilst asset identification is a byproduct of the scanning, it can also be a great benefit to the organization. The thing is, we're here to talk about how you actually secure the environments. And the power of this vulnerability scanning and the threat modeling that goes with it is not only do you identify the assets in the environment, but you're reaching through an ever-increasing database of content about operational technology, comprehensive threat models that can be built that pull in data from these suppliers around their equipment to show you very clearly where the key risks lie. it's kind of best to think about these vulnerability threat models as a stack of assets, top to bottom. So the engine powers these scans and looks at the entire supply chain, identifies all of the risks in these assets in the chain. And what it does is it actually then what actually can be taken immediately to mitigate the risk at the top of the chain, so that items further down the chain can actually be given breathing space, so you can plan a strategic approach rather than a reactionary approach. So by fixing that one thing at the top of the chain, you can actually buy yourself time further down that stack. It's a very good way of understanding what immediate actions need to be taken, whilst taking a breather and doing calculated modeling on what you need to do further down the stack. It buys you time. That's the key thing, really. So what this enables you to do is build up a prioritized patch plan. So some sort of way of saying, how do I approach this? Now I know where the risks lie. How do I go about actually targeting these risks and mitigating them? How do I try and take the first steps into increasing the security on my OT environments? So if vulnerability scanning was the first step, then the second step is all about tactical fixes. And we often have a lot of conversations around how to approach this. And I think really it can be overcomplicated sometimes when realistically there's a very simple way of approaching it. And I know sometimes it just feels like you've got to get everything done at once. But believe me, if you just take little steps at a time, you can actually get a handle on what's going on in the environment and put really good wins in very quickly. So with tactical fixes, it's all around the prioritized patch plan. You start updating your systems under change control in a way that doesn't impede the production environment. But at the same time, you make minimal invasive maneuvers that don't actually bring anything down and don't put at risk the systems. And thereby you're fixing the problems or mitigating the risks in that system chain. Now, doing these two steps alone will not only provide a clear view of the OT estate, but they remove some of the immediate concerns. And they also help demonstrate to the board and to the OT environment managers that the environment can be secured if an effort is expended in a very methodical approach, doesn't put the systems at risk. This can be done in tune with the downtime or the contracted downtime the systems are put into in order to do mechanical maintenance. Now, another part of this step is locking down access to these systems. Over time, and because these systems are really untouched most of the time and they're isolated away from the IT landscape, you may often find the access control models are not very good. They're open to abuse. They haven't been locked down tight enough over time because it's figured, well, who else is going to step into that operational space in that environment and actually do something with the consoles? But by implementing a more controlled access control protocol, you can immediately remove the chance of accidental damage through uncontrolled risk. The access control shouldn't stop at the corporate employees, though. It should be extended into the supply chain. Sometimes you find that you don't actually have a handle on who's actually going to your site and has access to these systems. But that's just as important as your own staff having access or not having access to these environments. Do you know the engineers that turn up to do the maintenance on your OT systems? Do they have open access to the systems? Is it worth working with the maintenance company or the maintenance firm who do this work from your supply chain to understand who should be permitted to attend the site and who should be permitted to touch particular systems? And by doing this, you can actually put stronger access controls on these systems and lock them down tight. This removes any sort of unnecessary risk. So we've now done sort of a vulnerability assessment. We understand our landscape through the first step. We understand the patching plans, and we've started to implement step 2, which is tactical fixes such as patching systems, locking down security access, taking a strong look at our supply chain, understanding who has access and who really does need to have access to the systems. So we understand where we are. We can now look at how we move ahead with more strategic planning, or the third step of the chain. And this is where we start to relax a bit and get into the method of actually what we want to do moving forwards on a robust basis that is repeatable. So we start to look at strategic plans, and thanks to the threat modeling we did earlier on, we know what we can implement immediately, and we can know what we need to do over time. Now, this can be controlled and aligned with the system's maintenance, as we said earlier on. Planned downtime can happen at the same time as mechanical downtime. These can be controlled and managed by the manager themselves in line with the security team and the CISO. This activity is what we've done so far is we've provided an audit trail or a way of demonstrating to the corporation and the OT managers that this is achievable, and that's a key thing. Gaining the trust of the managers of these environments is critical to actually enabling you to actually continue to do these systems upgrades, systems patches, and security investment over time. Now, the OSs updates will remove another level of risk as well, because we know that these OSs are often not updated, as we saw earlier on from Windows XP, Windows 2000, they're left dormant. So we can start to plan how we'd actually do this in a controlled way. Once we get the OT landscape in a better shape, we can start to feed logs to systems like Seams. We use Seams all the time for monitoring our IT environments, feeding logs in. But you can also feed your OT logs in as well from critical systems. There's companies out there now who offer a way of integrating all these OT logs into your core SIEM and SOC, thereby giving your SOC team a much richer picture of what's going on across the whole entire landscape. They can start watching inbound traffic logs. They can proactively monitor your operational technology environment. And they can look for abnormal activity, highlighting areas of concern before these manifest into issues. It's critical to be able to deal with the problems. Another area you should look at considering as well is developing the robust OT security model. Some sort of policy that looks, through tools or through services available today, and how you can prevent issues that we spoke about earlier, such as Stuxnet. So there are companies out there now who produce drives that are actually put in line in the OT environments, and any USB sticks that come into that environment need to go through these devices first, which scans them and checks them to make sure there's no erroneous code on there that could cause problems. For example, if these devices had been present in the Stuxnet issue we talked about, potentially a USB drive would never have reached that corporate system and it wouldn't have actually had the impact it had. So it's definitely worth seeing whether or not these sort of technologies can be integrated into your OT policy structure. So it's overall saying we've got these 3 steps. So we know scanning is critical, and then we need to move on to tactical fixes. And then we can look at strategic fixes like updating OSs, retiring old systems, etc. But how do you go about doing this? What do you need to do in order to actually make these steps active? How do we actually go on this road? And how do we ensure the organization moves forward as one? These are key elements, and it's not all about the technology. It's often about the people. So one of the key areas that we talk about a lot when we talk to our clients about trying to do this is the education side. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's vital you bring your employees and your security personnel along for the ride on this whole journey. They're the key to making this successful. We need to make sure that the security teams and the managers of the OT landscapes are in unison, in sync. And when a breach or if a breach or outage is understood, what the impact is of this breach, then everyone's on the same page and we'll actually try and work together to try and get these systems patched and secured. And you have a common alignment moving forwards. And I think ensuring the impact of these issues, of these breaches, is the key to doing this. And often simple education with these environments, these managers, to emphasize the risks that are out there now from these attackers really does go a long way to actually helping them get on board with the idea of actually bringing the environments forward. Organizations that operate OT environments, and have implemented strong security education programs are often more receptive, and they understand the need to patch systems and continue to improve security and processing. So it's definitely worth investing a lot in your educational side when it comes to actually trying to tackle the OT environment and what you're going to do in this space. So with these steps defined and activities planned and a strategy, and we now know we've got to do an educational plan as well and bring this company along with us on the journey, it's essential to ensure these routines are adhered to. It's all for nothing if we put a lot of effort in up front to scanning, doing tactical fixes, if we don't keep this rolling forwards, day in, day out, month on month, year on year. All the effort getting to this point is going to be a waste if we break this routine and organizations fall back into their old ways of leaving OT environments alone or not patching them or leaving them on outdated operating systems. So continual improvement is the key. And there are further tools out there that can be introduced to enhance your vulnerability scanning models. They can add to or bolt onto your existing environments once you've got the main bits up and running. It's important to ensure that security investments are completely in unison or in harmony with investments you've already made. There are a lot of people out there currently selling a lot of different security systems, and often systems don't interact or talk nicely to each other. There's no point in bringing a new system in that's going to introduce so much complexity into the environment that everyone falls back on the method of saying, well, we'll just leave it alone then because it's too complex to update. So it's always critical to make sure any other security measures you bring into your OT space are in harmony with what's already there. Because the last thing you want to do is take a step backwards because of the complexity that's introduced. So just to sort of finish off, I was going to think about what the future of defense is. In the IT space, we've seen a lot of talk over recent years, and there are companies I deal with as well, where we've started introducing the notion of, I'll be very careful with the terminology here, narrow AI. So most critically, machine learning technology into security spaces. There are companies out there like Darktrace, Vector Networks, who have really run with the AI model, the machine learning model, in what they've done recently in security. And they've got some really good ideas and really good solutions. But, That's in the IT space. Will we see this happen in the OT space? I think the future of the OT space is probably a blend, but I think it'll take longer to get to that point. And we definitely won't be doing automated autonomous defense, I don't think, in this space for a while. There needs to be a level of trust built up to say that the machine learning elements in the OT space are capable of making the right decisions that won't bring the production lines or the systems down when we don't want them to come down. So whilst in the IT space, people are starting to relax a little bit about the AI starting to do actions and defense mechanisms on its own, I think in the OT space, it'll take a bit longer, but it's certainly something that's worth considering in the future. So just to sum up a few key takeaways here, I think the key is to remember that there is technology out there right there today that's proven, has a background that can help you tackle the OT space. And it's not about going in 100 miles an hour and trying to fix every problem straight away. One of the best things you could do today is literally go out and work with a company to do a vulnerability scan of the OT space. It's minimal invasive. It gives you a clearer picture of what's going on across your estate, and it gives you an idea of where your key risks lie before you even start to try and tackle some of the problems. Once you've got this view, you can then start saying, how do I target the vulnerabilities that are the key vulnerabilities that if I do this will buy me time? Because the whole thing about the operational space is you don't want to rush at this. You want to actually look at what do I need to do now that will give me the breathing room I need to tackle the rest of my OT space in a controlled way that doesn't introduce risk. This will allow you to update key systems, rationalize systems, remove redundant systems that aren't used anymore, but for some reason are still lying around. And then another thing is to look at the protocols, the security protocols we talked about, such as access to site, access to systems. Are some of these systems left wide open for half the employees in the organization to get into them? You know, can I make the security protocols around these systems tighter? And then finally, to do some sort of educational plan. We do IT education a lot. Within our organization itself, we do a lot of security education of our staff. But in the OT space, is this taken as seriously? I don't know. We're not an OT environment ourselves, but the clients we talk to sort of intimate that whilst the IT environments are very good at doing the education, in the OT space, production is first and foremost, and sometimes these sort of things fall by the wayside. But a little bit of education can often help. And believe me, the OT managers who are in charge of these systems want their systems to remain up as much as we do. And so it's how we work together with them to understand the environments and how we can best help each other to secure these environments. But just to go back to a point I made earlier on, just to reiterate it, because I think it's a key thing people forget, is everyone's in this together. It's amazing when you start reaching out to colleagues or other security consultants, how many of them are willing to just down tools and give you some tips and hints and ideas and help. We're all fighting a common adversary, and there's a lot more of us out there if we all work together than the attackers who are trying to attack our environments. We can definitely learn off each other. So I think following these 3 simple steps we went through, understanding your environment, tactical fixes, and strategic methods is a good way of approaching the situation. And I hope it was of use to some people. And if I leave with anything, I can just leave saying that it's not as daunting as it first seems, and there are simple steps that can be taken to get a handle on the environment, to start making an inroad into securing your OT environment. Okay, well, thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Scott. So a lot to think about there, but let's try and answer some of your questions. And just as a quick reminder, you can ask your questions by either using the chat function and typing it in there, or by raising your hand by pressing the small hand icon on the main panel, and Connie will then unmute your phone so that you can ask your question. Connie, I'll just hand over to you so you can control this, if you please.
Hi, thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Scott, very much for the presentation. So we already have some questions coming in. The first is, how do you convince CIOs and CFOs to spend more on recruiting more people to the IT security and network teams to build out the ideas and solutions you have proposed, especially when your current team especially when your current teams are so incredibly stretched working on other projects and or BAU activities?
Yeah, investment. This is always the key question, isn't it? I mean, security's had a pretty bad ride over the years, and when it comes to investment, it's always seen as a necessary evil. A good analogy is often it's the insurance policy. You don't know you need it till you need it. So I can see where the question is coming from. It is a very valid one. I think from my experience personally, and different things work for different people, but I think nothing speaks more loudly to the CIOs and CFOs than a monetary impact value. So if you're able to demonstrate or put in front of them figures that show what downtime on a system due to a breach would actually mean on the bottom line, it's often a good starting point for starting to get attention as to what this could mean to the corporation. If you're able to demonstrate that a system that's down offline means production ceases for 1 hour, what does that equate to it in real monetary value? And that's a good starting point, because often you'll find that far outweighs the cost of introducing another security expert into the company. It is a really tough question, and I think it's one you need to look at your own individual organization to understand. But I definitely say, from a manufacturing organization, yeah, monetary value. So the impact of a system being down versus the cost of employing an individual who's got the expertise to keep that system up. It's definitely a good starting point. You normally find that's a very good way to at least get the conversation on the table in the boardroom to have a serious discussion around security. There's been enough of these problems now out there as well. It's often useful to pivot to some of the problems we've seen in recent years. So WannaCry a few years ago was a major impact on so many organizations ranging from manufacturing to financial to medical. It was unheard of. And I think no one wants to go down that road. And that was purely IT. Imagine it happening to OT. As I said earlier on, I think we're in a very weird climate now where you could almost say food supply, packaging supply, medical supplies through manufacturing companies are just as critical as power utilities, and sewage and everything else. So perhaps now is the time to have that conversation around the importance of these organizations and these operational technology systems, and that they do warrant serious investment. So that's a long-winded answer for a simple question, but it's a difficult one to answer normally. I think the main thing is monetary value of impact. It's normally the way to get the attention. Okay. I was looking at a question, seeing another question come in here. So question says, when my team attempted to apply the latest patches to some of my OT systems, we introduced challenges and/or system crashes. How can I be sure the scanning won't introduce failures in the older systems? Yeah, okay, that's a good point. I'm kind of surprised that you're doing introducing patches. This is the primary problem that often happens in organizations, is the reluctance to introduce patches. Vulnerability scanning that we're talking about is non-invasive. It's not something that goes out and actually does proactive fixes on environments. So I wouldn't advocate that to an OT environment straight away. You've got to look at scans that literally just go out and assess what is out there and look to see what the threat looks like. I mean, some of the ones that we work with, for example, they will draw up a threat model that shows you in graphical form all the stack of systems within that environment, and it highlights the risks on the different elements. And what it does to do this is actually it's checking in with a huge catalog full of information around those systems and what level of firmwares and patches they should be sitting on. And then it cross-checks that against the known exploits on these environments, so it can highlight to you what the threats are. So it's not actually doing work that's going to be contradictory to the system staying online. It's just doing analysis of the systems that are out there in a non-invasive way to give you the report you need in order to understand the action you should take. So the vulnerability scanning this is why I say it's such a key thing to get done first, because it lets you understand the size and scale of the problem you're facing.
Great, thank you, Scott. We also got another question. Probably is also can be used to get people thinking a bit. So what do people do today to ID assets and manage vulnerabilities in OT and ICS?
Environment. I guess it's a mix depending on the organization's age, history, and everything else. I mean, some organizations in the OT space just rely on old school asset management catalogs. The idea being that kit, when it's deployed to the floor, it's logged in the asset register and it's managed that way, which over time can fall by the wayside. You find it isn't kept as up to date as perhaps it should be. So I think history has shown that we're not great at the OT space. I said earlier on about the reluctance to touch it. I mean, I often refer to it, and it's not my quote. A gentleman I know called Steve Katz referred to it as he talked about being the third rail. It's kind of like, we don't want to touch it. If it works, just leave it alone. Just leave that environment running, producing the beer or the food or whatever it's producing. So I think it's just it's one of these things where over time we don't proactively go out there and introduce new technologies into that space. And I think the time has come, or it's past the time where we really should think about how we do this. And the first thing, as I say, is the vulnerability assessment, which helps populate your asset database. From there, you can look at, well, how do we introduce other measures that are not going to cause damage, but will help secure that environment. So I think over time, historically, it's old methods of asset management, but I think we need to move beyond that now. We're well beyond that point.
Great, thanks, Scott. And we've got another one. We don't currently scan our OT network and only have a small IT team. Is this going to generate a huge additional workload, and how will we know what problems to fix first?
Yeah, good question. I think none of us have a really huge security team. We seem to be very small. But I guess the vulnerability scanning, it doesn't introduce a great deal of work. It can be done very simply. If you think about how we do it in the IT networks, these scans can be set up and put in place very fast. Just do external probing, and then the deeper you want to go, obviously you spend a bit more time on it. I think to do scans on your OT environment, it doesn't actually take long to set up and do initial scans to give you your first pass. And remember, what it does is it's just trying to highlight to you the risks you have. How you actually then deal with them, I think, yes, is very much dependent on the size of your team and the amount of time they can dedicate to it. But perhaps think of it another way. By at least getting the scan done, you know the size of the problem, and that can be your leverage with your CFO to invest into the problem. If your vulnerability scan shows you a lot of risk that you were not aware existed on that estate, there's probably nothing more powerful than that in order to get the board to understand the size of the problem and to give the capital needed to actually invest to do something about it. So therefore, you may get additional resources that you need in your team to then start looking at the problems and tackling the problems. And the beauty of this threat modeling is it shows you where to go first. So you may have 100 problems on your estate, but it shows you the problems you need to hit first in order to buy yourself that breathing room before you need to tackle the other problems. I guess it's one of those things we don't know what you don't know, which is why I'm a really big advocate of vulnerability scanning, because that at least it turns your lights on, lets you see what's out there, and then you can work on what you do next. Any other questions coming through?
Yes, one. How could affect a vulnerability scanning or penetration test the stability of an OT network? Is there a risk to lose an OT device during scanning?
Very minimal. There are normally different levels depending on which product you use, and there are different levels on how aggressive or not you want your scans to be. And you can always control this through ports you open or don't open on your firewalls and switches as well. So you can pretty much normally control exactly the areas you want exposed to the vulnerability tool at the time. Can cause problems if your network is overloaded as it is or reaching maximum thresholds for capacity, then potentially it could cause problems if all of a sudden you're sending scans out on your space. So that really it goes hand in hand with how highly occupied your network is that these devices will sit within. If you've got a LAN that's peaking and you're at risk of needing to upgrade the LAN anyway, I would say do not run vulnerability scans because they will flood the network with requests. And flood being a marginal term, what I mean is they'll send out a lot of requests. But if your operation technology network that these things are attached to is not the capacity and it's not really pushing any threshold boundaries, then a controlled vulnerability scan shouldn't create any main problems with this. You can control it through a number of mechanisms and control how aggressive it is or not. I would say it definitely helps working with consultants on this or working with a team who understand how to do this. Don't just go out there, buy the product, switch it on, because you might find it goes out with a full aggressive scan. You do need to work with a team who understand how to fine tune the scanning you're about to proceed with, and that should help you maintain a reasonable balance of scan results versus keeping all the OT environment intact.
Okay. Right, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, so I would hand over to our moderator, Jackie, again.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Then in that case, we'll close the call. Thank you very much indeed for joining this webinar, and there will be others in the next couple of weeks. And if anyone does have suggestions for topics that they'd like us to cover, then please do send a message through to the people who contacted you and invited you to the call. Thank you again for your time. Goodbye.
Thank you.